There is a particular kind of trust you give a bridge. You do not test it, you do not slow down, or read a sign, or wonder what is holding it up. You drive onto thousands of tons of steel suspended over open air and you think about your coffee. That trust is the most reasonable thing in the world. It is also, once in a great while, catastrophically misplaced. On the morning of January 28, 2022, in the East End of Pittsburgh, a few dozen people found out exactly how misplaced. Most of the city was still asleep. A handful of them were on the bridge. The Fern Hollow Bridge was not famous. It was not a landmark. It carried a single street, Forbes Avenue, across a wooded ravine in Frick Park, and roughly 14,000 cars crossed it every day without ever learning its name. It had stood for about half a century, long enough that nobody alive remembered the park without it. It was, in other words, exactly the kind of bridge you never think about, which is the whole point. Because here is the thing that makes this story different from almost every disaster you have ever heard about. This bridge did not fail without warning. It did not hide its condition, or fool its inspectors, or drop out of a clear sky. The Fern Hollow Bridge had been telling the people responsible for it that it was dying for 11 straight years. And every year, in writing, they wrote it down, and filed it, and drove over it again. Before we go any further, if you are the kind of person who wants to know what is actually holding up the world you move through every day, take a second to subscribe. It genuinely helps the channel. And I want to know one thing while you're here. What city are you watching from? And how old is the bridge you cross most often? Drop it in the comments. You may find you've never once thought about it. Now, let's get into it. Start with the paperwork, because the paperwork is the horror of this story. In 2011, inspectors rated the Fern Hollow Bridge in poor condition. Not failing, not closed, just poor, the lowest of the standard condition ratings, the one that means significant deterioration is present and getting worse. That rating did not go away. The bridge was still rated poor the next year, and the year after that, and at its very last inspection in September of 2021, 4 months before it fell. For over a decade, the official record kept saying the same thing, and for over a decade, the response was to come back and inspect it again. In 2017, inspectors went further. They recommended the bridge be overhauled, citing, in their words, general structure deterioration and inadequate strength. And they put a price on the fix, about $1.5 million. That project was never funded. In 2018, a resident walking the trail underneath the span looked up, saw one of the massive steel crossbeams rusted clean through, photographed it, and posted it online, asking more or less whether anyone was keeping an eye on this thing. The rust was not a secret buried inside the structure. It was visible from a hiking path. You could take a picture of it with your phone. To understand why that rust mattered so much, you have to understand what kind of bridge this was. Fern Hollow was built from something called uncoated weathering steel, and it's a clever idea. The steel is designed to rust, but only on the surface, forming a tight, reddish-brown skin called a patina that seals the metal underneath and then stops. A weathering steel bridge is supposed to protect itself. It never needs paint, but the trick only works if the water runs off. It only works if the steel is allowed to dry out between soakings. And on the Fern Hollow Bridge, the drains had clogged. Leaves, dirt, and road grit packed the low points of the structure. Every rain, every snow melt, every load of road salt thrown down for winter ice ran down the bridge's steel legs and pooled at the bottom, in the debris, and just sat there. The steel never got to dry. The protective patina never formed. Instead of sealing itself, the metal kept rusting deeper and deeper, year after year, until in places it wasn't weathering steel anymore. It was holes. And this bridge had no room for that. Fern Hollow was what engineers call fracture critical, or non-redundant, meaning it had key structural members with no backup. If one of them failed, there was nothing to catch the load, nothing to buy a second. One piece breaks, the bridge comes down. On this bridge, one of those critical pieces was a steel plate near the base of the southwest leg, and it had been quietly eaten away for years. by water that a clean drain would have carried harmlessly off. It gave out at about 6:37 in the morning. There was snow on the ground. A city transit bus was on the span, along with 4 other vehicles. When the southwest leg let go, the entire 447-foot bridge dropped. The whole thing, the roadway, the cars, the bus, roughly 100 feet into the ravine below. A 5th car, arriving at the edge just as it went, drove off the broken abutment and landed on its roof on the ground beneath. And then something close to a miracle happened, which is that nobody died. Rescuers reached the scene and found the bus tilted in the wreckage down in the ravine. Firefighters rappelled roughly 150 feet down the slope. When they got to the survivors, there was no clean way to bring them back up, so they did it with their hands. First responders and passers-by, forming a human chain up the hillside, a daisy chain of arms, physically hauling people out of the debris one at a time. A runner who happened to be passing stopped and joined in. A gas main had ruptured in the collapse, and the smell of gas hung over the whole scene while they worked, forcing nearby homes to evacuate. 10 people were injured. 4 went to the hospital. 2 were hurt seriously. But every single person who was on that bridge when it fell 100 feet into a frozen park walked away alive. 20 minutes later, at the height of rush hour, on a bridge that carried 14,000 cars a day, the number would not have been 10. Now, here is the part no screenwriter would dare to invent. Later that very same day, the President of the United States arrived in Pittsburgh. The trip had been scheduled weeks in advance, and the subject of the trip was infrastructure, specifically the roughly $1.2 trillion infrastructure law he had signed just months earlier. Money meant precisely for aging roads and bridges. He had flown in to talk about fixing America's bridges. And that morning, before he even landed, one of Pittsburgh's bridges had fallen into a park. He went to the site. He stood at the edge of the ravine and looked down at the bus in the wreckage. "I knew there were a lot of bridges," he said. "I had no idea. By the federal count, there are around 43,000 bridges in the United States in poor condition." He promised, standing there, to fix them all. The rebuild, at least, was fast. With federal infrastructure money, about $25 million, the state put a new bridge on an emergency fast track, and a brand new Fern Hollow Bridge opened to traffic before the end of that same year, less than 12 months after the old one fell. The verdict took longer. 2 years later, the National Transportation Safety Board released its final report, and it did not soften the language. The probable cause, it found, was corrosion and section loss in that fracture-critical plate on the southwest leg. Corrosion that resulted directly from the city of Pittsburgh's failure to act on repeated maintenance and repair recommendations. Similar recommendations, the board noted, had appeared in the inspection reports for more than 15 years. The bridge, the NTSB's chair said plainly, should have been closed and repaired more than a decade before it fell. Responsibility, she said, rested solely on the city that owned it. And when investigators tried to answer the simplest question of all, why? Why, with the rating in hand, the recommendations in writing, and the price tag known, did no one act? They couldn't get a clean answer. The record-keeping was poor. The staff had turned over again and again. The knowledge that the bridge was dying existed, on paper, the entire time. It just never turned into a decision. It fell through the same kind of gap the water fell through, the low spot where things collect and sit and are never carried off. So here is what this story is really about, and it is not one bridge in one city. The Fern Hollow Bridge was not an outlier. By the federal government's own count, more than 46,000 bridges in the United States, around 1 in every 13, are rated in exactly the condition Fern Hollow was in on the morning it collapsed: poor. After this, the NTSB urged inspectors to go check more than 10,000 other bridges built with the same uncoated weathering steel. And in Pittsburgh itself, a city with more of these aging spans than almost anywhere, the number of bridges rated poor today is higher than it was on the morning Fern Hollow fell. One engineer put it simply: the deterioration is outpacing the work to fix it. None of this is hidden. That is the thing to sit with. Every one of those bridges has a file. Every one has a rating, an inspection, a number that says how bad it is. The danger was never in the dark. It was written down, photographed, posted online, filed, and rated poor for 11 consecutive years. And 14,000 people a day drove over it anyway, trusting it the way you trust the floor. Wild things in the woods hide. This did not. It told us in plain language, in a document, every single year for over a decade, exactly what was going to happen. And the most dangerous thing about the bridge you cross most often is not that nobody knows its condition. It's that somebody does. And the report is sitting in a drawer,